My name's Julian Donaldson. I'm the CEO of the National Trust. Welcome to this very special event beneath the Bitumen. I'd like to acknowledge that all of our properties are situated on Aboriginal land across the state and that the National Trust recognises Aboriginal people remain the cultural and spiritual custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. We pay our respect to elders past and present. It's a great pleasure to see you here. Great pleasure to welcome one of the National Trust councillors, John Stevens, and also our members who are here tonight, Scott Chisholm from Terra Rosa, and also, this is where I run into trouble because I didn't bring my glasses, and Lauren Jolliffe, who's from Archaeos? Yeah. Correct. And you'll be meeting Sarah Murphy in a moment also, who will be leading the presentation. And a special call out to Kayleen Poon. Kayleen, you've seen a few of these, haven't you? This must be about your third. You can't get enough. So this is a really special moment that you've joined us for tonight. So what you're going to do is hear this fascinating story of burial, of the destruction of a graveyard, the creation of a school, then the development of a precinct for major adaptive reuse, and then the excavation of remains to make that development happen. And then this wonderful partnership that developed between the National Trust and Chunghwa. And that's why Kayleen being here tonight is so important, because Kayleen was our key contact at the Chunghwa Association. So amongst all of the things, and I promise Sarah I won't steal your thunder, but amongst all the things that we uncovered when the cemeteries over the other side of Plain Street were made ready for this development that I referred to, amongst all the things that were revealed was this amazing jacket that was worn by a Chinese gentleman about the 1890s or thereabouts. And Sarah from our team led the conservation. I think I've got a fly crawling on my forehead. Sarah led the National Trust team and then was able to, it's a mosquito, watch out, he might get you too. So Sarah led the conservation of this precious artefact, and we made contact with Chunghwa, and through Kayleen and President Ting's great representation reached out into the Chinese community, and we were able to raise funds to conserve the artefact that you'll be seeing and hearing about tonight. So it's one of those really special moments that National Trust members can have in a situation like this, in a wonderful environment in this chapel, on the cemeteries, across the road from the excavation. We've got the managing director of Terra Rosa, who undertook the excavation for the developer. And then we've got Lauren, who did the analysis of one of the braids of hair that was found on the site. So, you know, this is really good heritage stuff. So I'm glad you're here with us. It's going to be an exciting evening. Well, pretty exciting, you know. Better than Netflix, and then there'll be a Q&A afterwards. I probably won't be here for the Q&A because I do have to go in a little while, but having made the welcome, glad you're here. Do tell your friends about these sorts of events and encourage them to join the National Trust. If you know some people who like these sorts of things, we'd love to increase our membership and they can contact us to do that. The other thing which is really important is that we've also got an appeal going for the cemeteries. So the National Trust is a registered charity, and as such we're able to give tax deductible status to donations which are made to the National Trust. So any donation to the National Trust, you get a receipt and you claim that as a tax deduction. The appeal that we're running is designed to raise funds for the conservation of graves within this really important series of graveyards that we meet on today. From 1829 until 1900, the Perth Cemetery, the cemeteries of East Perth as we call them, because there were a number for each denomination. So have a little think about the appeal and donations, or tell your friends about the donations. Sarah may speak more about that later. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Scott from Terra Rosa to lead off tonight. Thanks.
So yeah, over the course of a program that took us a bit over a year in the end, we excavated the cemetery prior to development. And there's been a lot of time since then, I guess, to reflect on the project, and also I think at this time in Western Australia we're kind of looking at heritage in various different ways, whether it's Aboriginal, post-contact heritage for the state. And the big thing that we kind of, and I was thinking about what to talk about tonight, and outside of being available for questions, I guess, from you guys around any specifics regarding the program, you know, we spent, probably more than a year working there. We did a whole bunch of geophys leading up to it. That was all largely inaccurate because of a whole bunch of anomalies in the site. The site was heavily disturbed. You know, it was developed in the 1950s for a girls' school, some sports fields and all that sort of stuff. And I was thinking about that, and that for me kind of struck a chord, because we're a state that loves digging stuff up, right? And too much, probably. And being an archaeologist, that's what we get excited about sometimes too. But it was really interesting to see the way in which, and it was quite confronting actually when we were dealing with the burials itself, in the sense that the southern area of the block, so the block was sort of split in two, with an elevated southern area and a lower northern area. And in the middle there was a bund where a whole bunch of stuff had been pushed up to make two kind of flat surfaces for some playing fields. The old DOT, Department of Transport building, was up on the top. That was a total void. There was we dug down with some excavators probably 5-6 metres there to find if there was anything still remaining. And clearly everything had been hoofed out at some point, because it was part of the cemetery, clearly part of the cemetery, there was stuff around it, but there's nothing left. And so that's where we started the project, and we're like, oh, okay, maybe everything being cleared out. And as we worked down the block, and as some of the trees were cleared off the site, because there was a whole bunch of old she oaks and pines and stuff across the site, it became extremely evident that no, stuff was there, it just probably wasn't in the location it probably should be. So we had these 5 pits that we found where just a whole bunch of stuff had been piled into. So overall we pulled out probably about 460 known individuals, or minimum individuals that we said. 125 of those were present in those 5 mass graves that we had on site. We found bent and twisted lead coffins and broken headstones and all sorts of stuff throughout it. And it's just really reflective, I think, of just in how people's sensitivities are hopefully changing as we move forward as a state. But like, this is the mid-20th century, and just to act in this way to a whole bunch of people was just quite, you know, you're just like, that's intense, yeah. It was a very interesting project. It's been basically a unique look at a piece of history. And we're still struggling, I guess, to a degree with the legislation around these kind of programs as a state, in making sure that the State Heritage Office actually, you know, commits to making these projects what they could be. You know, like the regulations around what flows from these things is kind of interesting. So it's come down to the National Trust to sort of carry the can to a degree on making sure this project goes forward. Whereas private business is sort of like working as much as we can to make sure that goes along as well. And we've had some university partnerships that have been going along too. So there will be some interesting projects that come out of the back end of it. But I think for National Trust members and interested public, like the real thing is that Western Australia really needs to start taking its historical resources very seriously. And at the moment they're kind of not. You know, we're growing and we're moving. But if you comparative to the eastern states and how stuff works there, it's very different, even in our own record. But you know, I don't think we'd bulldoze a graveyard again today. Obviously, which we didn't. But you know, like it's pretty intense. You know, like the social outcry was when girls found some. It was a girls' school, obviously. They found some bones eroding out of the side of that embankment in the middle of the block. So. Yeah, it was pretty nuts. But yeah, the finds were very interesting. Some of the cultural material that was there was, you know, like it's, you know, one day I think one of our archaeologists scared herself into next century by finding a doll with its eyes open as she scratched away at the sand. So that was great. Yeah, And generally, the condition of the site was okay on the bottom block. In the middle and everything else, it was kind of a bit of a mess, I think. And that was all a bit of a sadness. Even the trees themselves were quite destructive to the burials. Like when we were trying to excavate around through the trees, the roots had actually entwined through the bodies and really impacted on our ability to extract individuals. But they're all at rest in Karrakatta now, which is great. And that's kind of the general consensus. But yeah, when I was thinking it all through about what we could talk about tonight, it's sort of, and again, happy to make myself available, and Maddie also, who won't probably answer any questions, was there throughout the project. Like if anyone's got any particular questions about the archaeology or the material assemblage, happy to talk about it. But yeah, I think I just really think that, the National Trust is a great vehicle, and we as a public really need to get behind some of our public institutions a bit more and advocate for change in how we enforce our legislation, because you don't want to see what happened in the 1950s again, and then pushing for more and more development where we actually consider what's in the ground a bit more would be a positive, I think. So yeah, there you go.
It is incredible when we look at this project in the context of the outcry over, say, Juukan Gorge. In the 1950s, to have had a cemetery literally bulldozed flat with the headstones, turned into the ground, and large masses of bodies which had been respectfully buried in the previous century, put into a pit. You can't believe that happened, just 70 years ago. It's quite amazing. So that's one of the stories that comes out of this particular series of issues that we're confronting. But there were some human remains, and Lauren is going to talk about those. So at the time, Lauren was doing her thesis at Notre Dame University, and she's now working as an archaeologist.
Hello. So a couple of years ago, when all this was going down, I was in the incredible position of there being hair available to conduct my honours on, which I sat down for a while and thought, oh, what am I going to do? In the past, you might have heard of like isotope testing and things, but I dug down, and there's this whole new form of elemental concentration testing. I won't go into the boring science details, but basically it tells you the chemical concentration for most of the elements of the periodic table. This is significant because most researchers have avoided this on the account of getting 64 elements for however many samples you have and not knowing how any of them got into this person's hair, because obviously in day-to-day life we're constantly exposed to an innumerable amount of chemical sources. And breaking down how this gets into the human body and what it might be is actually a huge task. In hindsight, I might not have taken it on, but there you go. So my research was aimed at, I had 9 Chinese samples, I believe, from the Chinese cemetery and 11 from the Presbyterian cemetery. And I wanted to use this technique to try and understand the health and the sort of physical environment and challenges that these people were experiencing in Perth in the 1890s, and how different it would have been from life today. So I set about testing them all and compared them to a group of comparable people living in the same areas, so Subiaco, Perth, East Perth today, which obviously took a lot of ethics requirements. Like Scott said, there's a lot of legislation to get through in terms of being able to use human remains. But we got there, and I ended up with over 4,000 independent results to analyse, which was a lot. So I broke it down into themes that I'd recognised through the historical record and all my research, and also some trends that I was noticing in the chemical data. So first of all, I wanted to focus on typhoid, which you might have heard. There was an epidemic occurring in Perth at the time. Basically, Perth, in the matter of years, transformed from this sort of backwater, agricultural, providing food for ourselves type economy to becoming an industrialised metropolis with people coming in by the boatload that we couldn't feed, basically, with the established agriculture we had at the time. So obviously this developed a lot of health issues for the colony. People were living in tiny houses stacked upon each other, some which might not even be called houses if we're being generous, stables and the like. And there were no sewerage systems. 1 and 2 goes together. A lot of people were getting sick, getting typhoid, diarrhea, all the nasties that you get from drinking sewerage water, basically. The colony was still surviving off well water, so there was a public scheme in place to bring scheme water from a dam up in the hills, Victoria Reservoir, down to the city. And if you read through the historical record, it's a really interesting tale of, you know, public issues, community outcries, the water's not good enough, no one wants to use it. And if you read the newspapers, it seems like your classic government flop, basically. But I started looking at these samples and I had some really interesting elements come up in some of the people's hair. And once I'd walked through and established that they couldn't have got them from anywhere else, we're talking uranium, cerium, erbium, holmium, really weird elements that you wouldn't expect outside a radioactive plant, but actually occur naturally as several compounds in our Bassendean soil system, which we weren't really using to agriculture at the time because we hadn't developed phosphatic fertilizers. So as you know, our dune systems are basically sterile in terms of growing crops. So I was scratching my head as to how these weird compounds in some sands that occur here and in Canada somehow got into these people's hair. And then I had one of those epiphany moments that we were using the Bassendean sands to build concrete, and we were lining the scheme water pipes with concrete. And that's the only, I've gone through it, it's the only way I could possibly see an uptake of these chemicals, which presents a really interesting story because, of course, the scheme water was introduced in 1892, I believe, and our Chinese and Presbyterian people were buried in the cemeteries between 1881 and 1899. So I had a small group of Presbyterians who didn't have any of these fancy chemicals, and then almost all the Chinese people and all of the half the Presbyterians, pardon me, had all these weird elements, and the only thing that could possibly indicate is a systemic uptake, basically, of the scheme water, which is really interesting when you start to unpack it, because at this time the typhoid epidemic is still ongoing. A lot of people are getting sick, but once the scheme water is introduced, it's actually an increase in prevalence, so more people are getting it because the population is bigger. But in terms of virulence, the severity and how many people are dying, being hospitalised, drops off dramatically, which quite frankly could only mean that your virulence is impacted by the viral dosage you get, so how much you're exposed to something. If you're having a bit of contaminated water, but mostly clean water, then your body has a much better chance at fighting it. So I started looking into their zinc levels, which was really interesting. And everyone off the board had very low zinc levels, the sorts that, you know, if you went to your doctor, they'd be looking at, there's something wrong with you. You need to take zinc supplements, you're fighting off a disease, because that's what happens when your body is fighting off disease. Your immune system uses the zinc, and so you might have zinc through your diet, but if it's not being deposited in your hair, that means your body is probably using it all. So that was, well, quite frankly, fascinating in terms of, well, the difference between what history says and maybe what was going on, and it's something I'd certainly like to unpackage further. What's the time? I'll carry on. I looked at a few other themes as well. One thing that really did strike me was the debauchery and the Wild West attitudes that seem to come through the historical record. You read, you know, the old newspapers and the old police bulletins, and people are shooting each other, getting kicked out of bars and all sorts of, not what you would expect to occur today, but probably does. Perth seemed like very much a frontier town, and alcoholism seemed to be systemic. I thought it would be really interesting to investigate this, particularly in the Presbyterian and the Chinese groups, because of course Presbyterians theoretically aren't supposed to drink, which many of them probably do now to certain degrees. But what the attitudes would have been, back then, whether it was as lax, and also the Chinese group, because this is a group that's come from China, where they have different practices, and whether or not they're being integrated into our cultural norms or not. So the Presbyterian group, if you've got chronic alcoholism, your liver and your kidneys, to a degree, obviously begin to malfunction. And that's what you would expect with the level of alcohol that it was supposedly being consumed. If you start to read, all of the shop records and our imports and things, the Presbyterians didn't have any sign of liver failure, kidney failure, perfect health, other than all the typhoid issues and all that. But the Chinese were a completely different story. Most of them didn't have any chemicals that you would associate with chronic alcohol or drug abuse, but 3 of them actually had incredibly high levels of sodium, dangerously high. Sodium isn't associated with your liver or kidney, your liver or alcohol at all, but quite frankly, to have that high level of sodium, the only reason I would expect is that they are eating salt, basically, or that they do have high-end kidney failure, which may or may not have contributed to their deaths and interment at the cemetery. Obviously, there's a number of factors that can contribute to kidney failure, but having so many in such a small group, I decided to look further into opium addiction in Perth, which obviously was more widespread than we thought amongst the Europeans and the Chinese. There was this whole underground business going on with people being arrested and traded and smugglers. It's a fantastic read if you ever fancy looking into that kind of thing. But what interested me was if we were dealing with 3 young men, because almost all the Chinese people buried here were young men, dealing with opium abuse, possibly, what that would mean. Because of course it's not to say that 3 and 9 or whatever experienced it. It would be that 3 possibly in 9 who died and never made it home might have been affected by drug abuse and such. Which is fascinating when you consider the transient Chinese population we had at the time. We're talking about groups of young men coming out to the colony to earn money through gold, living, what have you, and then eventually they would move back to China, settle down, have a family, and as we know, some of them never made it. When you start looking into the historical record, a really interesting story emerges about changes in attitude. Up until 1870, 1880, the colony is very tolerant, almost positive, but not quite, to Chinese and other people. We had a small population. A lot of people who were coming to help out were welcomed. Obviously, there were some notable exceptions who didn't like anyone who was European, but overall, the colony was very tolerant. When you start reading the records, for example, of the lunatic asylum from the 1880s into the 1890s, there's this huge attitude shift. A disproportionate number of Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese young men in particular were being condemned to the lunatic asylum compared to Europeans. And as you read through the years, there's a massive attitude shift from this is a problem to we need to remove these people from our colony, and the beginnings of the White Australia policy attitude start coming in. And it directly correlates to the attitudes that started being presented in the newspapers and even in the police bulletins for arrests. People are increasingly racialized, like as opposed to, you know, just saying their name, they'd be referred to as a Chinaman and then whoever they were and whatever they had done. And this, quite frankly, really interested me. If we've got an increasing institutionalization of people of a small racial group, and the effect of mental health, drug abuse, and, you know, physical illness resulting in possible death, it's something that's not really covered at all in terms of West Australian history, and I think it's something we really ought to look into more in terms of the diversity of people who have made up our population. And yeah, many of them left, but Perth wouldn't be what it is today without all of the other people who came and built it. So there's plenty more research for me to do. I still have thousands of results to even consider and plenty more records to look through as I pull together this story of what happened to everyone and how we can tell that from the many elements in their hair. But if anyone has any questions or concerns, I'll be here. Thanks.
Thank you. I guess that's one of the great things that we experience by interrogating history and valuing heritage is we often come up with more questions than we might ever have imagined at the beginning of the journey. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Sarah Murphy. Sarah is our Manager, Interpretation and Collections from the National Trust. And Sarah has, in a sense, stewarded this program from just a tiny little idea to what you see here today, which is a series of stories which are jointly authored by the National Trust and the Chinese community. And of course the conservation of that amazing piece of material that makes the jacket.
It's a little bit hard to think of new things to say that aren't already in the exhibition, but I think I'll squeeze a few things out. Thanks to both Lauren and Scott, and I'm going to try to add a little bit more around what they've shared with us tonight. The material culture that's come from the excavation is really outstanding. You know, the excavation of a colonial cemetery in Australia is an extremely rare thing, as it should be, and often occurs because of development rather than any other reason. And the excavation that has occurred, what that's left us with is a large collection of artefacts, and it gives us the opportunity for the research that's been done already, plus research that's going to come later, long beyond our lifetimes. And the other thing that it does is not only informs us about the Chinese and the Presbyterians in Perth in the colonial period, but also about the broader East Perth Cemetery site, because we know that there are burials here. There are over 10,000 of them. And we know that there were strict regulations on how burials were to be done. But the excavation has actually been able to confirm exactly what happened. So that's kind of the difference between the theory and the actual practice, that we've been able to match those up through this excavation. So when the excavation was completed, the National Trust took over the care of all the artefacts. So as Scott and Lauren have mentioned, the human remains have gone to Karrakatta Cemetery and have been interred in ossuary boxes there. And all of the non-human remains have come to the National Trust. And we've got over 60 enormous crates of material, plus I don't know how many metres of pieces of coffin. Unfortunately, a lot of the excavation was going on in the summer, and that wasn't really conducive to the artefacts surviving very well once they were uncovered. So a lot of the material is it's incredibly fragile anyway, but there was a lot of material that just couldn't be kept because it just disintegrated. So even those little pieces of coffin that are in the showcase in the exhibition, what you're seeing on there is a stenciled decoration that was stenciled onto black fabric, and then the fabric was stretched over the coffin to disguise how cheap the timber was. And it looks like metal because it's a lead-based paint, but when the slightest touch and it just disintegrates into powder. And we've got shelves of that material that will all need conservation. But what was particularly exciting to me was while the excavation was underway, I came out to the site and Julian and a couple of other colleagues and had a chat to everybody, and among the discoveries at that time included that jacket. And I was so excited about that, and so I started looking into it a little bit, and then it was through the first lockdown that we had for COVID, I was doing some research into it, and it was a bit tricky because a lot of the museums I wanted to contact were all closed and everybody was at home. So the assessment I did of the significance of that jacket needs review now that everybody's back and operational. But when I was looking into it, I couldn't find another museum collection in the country that had a jacket of that type. There were jackets like dinner jackets and someone's fancy dress and all that kind of thing that was scattered in different collections, both the WA Museum and collections interstate. But to find an ordinary man's jacket from the 19th century, I haven't been able to find one. Now that doesn't mean there isn't one in a museum collection there, but that's research for later. So immediately, just as a jacket, I was aware that in its own right was incredibly rare. The fact that it was a Western-style jacket on the body of a Chinese person makes it even rarer still. And that jacket has to be undoubtedly of national significance. It is so rare. The other thing is, because it is from the Chinese cemetery, we know the exact date. It's between 1888 and 1899, so you don't always get to date things that precisely. Once the work was further underway with the excavation, we got quotes from textile conservators to conserve the jacket, and it's an extremely expensive process. There were some human remains in the jacket that needed to be extracted, and it was a rock-hard lump, basically, of tree roots and sand and so on. And a textile conservator, Rinska Karsh, is in the Great Southern, conserved the jacket and over a period of over 6 months, and it was a very slow process. And she used over 200 entomological pins to pin all of that into position. So when you look at it close up, you can see some tiny little dots holding it all in place. So we now have this most remarkable artefact, and the singlet and the vest that were also found with it, but there was no evidence of a shirt, but he would have undoubtedly been wearing a shirt too. And with the jacket, there's also a little piece of fabric with some buttons on it, which is the top of his trousers. So there's a little bit of that. And the analysis of the wool that makes up that jacket shows that it was made from 3 different sources of wool, and the fabric is like a Harris tweed, to give you a sense of what it was like in real life. And so we don't know who the person was that was buried in that jacket, but it was undoubtedly the best clothes, because that's the kind of respect that you show to people. But what it shows us is how quickly the Chinese were assimilating into the community here. And a lot of that was because of the racism that they were subject to. And so they tried very quickly to assimilate into the community. And the photograph that's in the exhibition as well, that shows the Chinese family, that was taken 3 years after the Chinese cemetery closed. So it's concurrent with the style of that jacket. And you can see from what the family's wearing, they're wearing full-on European clothing. The woman's wearing a brooch and so on. So it's very clear evidence of how the Chinese were living here at the time. With the other artefacts that were found, there were some other things other than what is in the showcase. There were a couple of jade bracelets, and unfortunately they're still in storage because we just didn't have sufficient security for them here. But they were most likely with female bodies, as I understand, Scott, and they're incredibly significant artefacts. There were also things like buckles and pins and remains of shoes and all of these types of things, but the jacket was the most intact object that was brought out of the Chinese cemetery. There were different types of artefacts in the Presbyterian cemetery, and we have those artefacts too. Where artefacts were found in association with named individuals, they went to Karrakatta with those burials. So Scott referred to a doll that was found, and that doll was found with the young girl that had owned the doll, and the doll has gone to Karrakatta with her. So there were a few variations on what actually occurred with some of the artefacts, but it was just felt that that was the right thing to do with those types of artefacts. So we now have not only this jacket, but all the other artefacts that still need conservation, and there is a remnant of a timber headstone or grave marker that we have in the fridge, also from the Chinese cemetery, and you can see some Chinese characters on that, and it's in a gazillion different pieces, but that's also incredibly rare. It's only the second timber grave marker that we're aware of left from East Perth Cemeteries. The other one is in the WA Museum's collection, and it's far more intact. So that's another artefact that does need conservation in time, along with the other artefacts that we have. With the exhibition, the focus of the exhibition is about the jacket. So there are more stories to be told that will come through from the material that we have. But it's been a great honour to work with members of the Chunghwa Association with this exhibition. So not only did the Chunghwa Association help raise the funds within a month for the conservation of the jacket, but also worked with us in terms of designing the exhibition, doing the translation into Chinese so that it was in dual language, and promoting it through the Chunghwa Association and its members. So it's been fantastic to be able to work with the community and to be able to promote the exhibition and work closely, particularly with people like Kayleen. So that's been a particular highlight. So I think what we have now ahead of us is not only the conservation of the material culture we have left from the excavation, but to research that more on it and to understand what it means and what else it can tell us. So there will be students, including Lauren and beyond, who will want to look at this material because it is so important and rare, and to look at what that can tell us about the community of Perth prior to 1899. So it's something to look forward to, and hopefully you can pass the word around that we've not only got this tax deductible appeal for the graves here, but we also have a tax deductible appeal for the artefacts in our collections. So should you like to help demonstrate your commitment to caring for our heritage, we'd very much welcome your donations. And also through your membership of the Trust, we can do these types of exhibitions more often and share more of the material that we have currently in storage with you so that you can actually see it in real life. So that brings me to my conclusion, I think.
So I think one of the fascinating things about this for our members is that it demonstrates the diversity of interest that the National Trust has in conserving and activating Western Australia's heritage. I think a lot of people think of the National Trust as being that organisation that opens little white houses with brown furniture and red ropes, where we're met by wonderful volunteers to tell us the stories of those places. But of course, our work is far more diverse than that. It covers the collection that Sarah manages, which has over 20,000 artefacts, some of which are provenance to the places that we look after, and some of which are associated, and some of which are just there because they're important. We have vast interests in natural heritage through private covenanting programs where we assist people protect the natural heritage values of bushland. So the work that we do is very broad. And this is one of those really precious moments today where we can share the diversity of our work with you. So what we're going to do is ask our three speakers to sit on the chairs at the front and invite questions that we might have from the floor. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask so that we can drill a little deeper to satisfy your interests?
That's a good question, and I've been trying to find out for quite some time. So the Royal WA Historical Society many years ago had a plaque made, and it was on a plinth just on the corner of where the Chinese cemetery boundary was. And when the development started, that was still there. And I've been talking with the developers and they're trying to locate it, and I've had a chat with Scott and he's not aware that it was on site. We were talking about it only earlier, so we're looking into it and we're trying to find it. I would be very surprised if it had been thrown out because everyone has been too careful for that. We've just got to find where someone safely stored it. So it hasn't been forgotten.
Thank you. So I've got a question for Lauren. So what do we know from your research about the sort of diet that people might have had in the 19th century? So there's not a lot of zinc. Is there other elements that would be found in our diet that were absent from the diet at that time?
Yeah. So that's a stone I've only half unturned. I started to look into the nutritional elements. Obviously, we categorise elements into different branches in terms of how you ingest them, etc. So some of the individuals had really high levels of calcium, for example, and I started to look into the milk drinking habits of the Europeans at the time, because the Presbyterian group actually had significantly higher levels than the Chinese. It was fascinating because of we were having agricultural issues. Obviously, we went from, I think, 40,000 to 120,000 people in less than a decade. And our established agriculture hadn't yet reached out to the wheat belt, and we were struggling to feed the people we had, essentially, and none to say the people who kept coming in. So Perth was relying almost entirely on food imported from the eastern states, and a lot of it was cured meats, salted meats, like canned fruit and the like. And also butter products that are preserved in, I'm not sure how they did it, quite frankly. I think it was probably fetid when it arrived. So I started linking like the zinc deficiencies to a lack of fresh meat. Also really high iron, which interested me. I started looking into milling techniques, and turns out more modern milling techniques for wheat, rice, etc. actually remove the husk from the grains. So we get more zinc out of them, but less iron, which really interested me. So that's a pathway I'd like to look down, whether having less processed grains was affecting their diet. And you have to remember that we're judging their chemicals by what we consider healthy today, and that's very much influenced by tests that we've run on a set of Western people who live in this environment. It's not to say that you can't be healthy with a different diet, it's just the one that we're used to. And so anomalies outside of that aren't indicative of ill health, but perhaps cultural change, and that's something I'd certainly like to look into, yeah.
Yeah, so, we had a team of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists working, processing the remains as they came out of the yard. Interestingly, in the Chinese cemetery, I think there's two things before the demographic analysis actually even kind of is that meaningful, would be that it was heavily impacted, that whether the positioning of the DOT building, the intact portion was basically on the western extent of the block, such as we have it at the moment. So there was an intact line of graves next to the house. There was 44 grave cuts, and of those there was 34 burials pulled out of those. So there was about 10 or so graves that were actually empty, and part of that was the practice, apparently at the time, of re-exhuming remains, and potentially taking them home. So the ratio of men to women's probably in that sample's fairly random, I suppose. But from contemporary accounts, a lot of young Chinese men were coming to the colony to work. But it does show that there was also Chinese women here, sort of coming along to set up home, I guess, at the time. So that's it's kind of one of those things where our sample size in that regard was fairly small, so I'm not sure extrapolating too much from it would be. Whether there's some misinterpretations from the contemporary record. The forensic specialists that were involved were from Flinders Uni and quite across, what they were up to. So yeah, it'll be an interesting kind of exercise to work with you, Karen, moving forward. Yeah, and I think it's important to try to compare those, and that's part of the stuff that we haven't really done yet, is sort of look at what's come out and the demographic sort of record we have there, and even the broad osteoarchaeological analysis that's been done to date, and then tying it back to some of the contemporary records and sort of comparing the two. And that's part of what Lauren's done, obviously, from a forensic perspective, but it hasn't really been done yet elsewhere.
I did start looking into it as well, because in the years following, I think there was maybe like 1 woman on the immigration records, 5 another year. To have 7 was astounding. But there is a few issues at play here. As Scott said, sample size, like because there's so little here. But you also have to think of the sample that you have. So one of the founding principles of paleopathology, you can't just count numbers, essentially. You have to think that this is a sample of not the people, but the people who died. So if you're looking at, it was mostly young Chinese people who were emigrating to Australia, mostly men. But at this time, mortality rates for ages were very different for men and women. Women lived longer. They weren't necessarily doing as hard, intensive labour. But a lot more of them died younger. So a very limited sample of the young men who would have emigrated to Australia and then returned to China would have died here and remained in the cemetery, whereas you'd be looking at a higher mortality rate for women because obviously childbirth at the time would be represented. You've also then got the issue of it's very difficult to... so when skeletons decay, as many of them here were, unless you've got the pelvis, it's very hard to determine sex. We've got a lot of literature that you can compare femur length, jaw structure, but a lot of the values in Western science are based on Western populations. When you're looking at Chinese people who are often of smaller stature from certain regions, it becomes increasingly difficult because there's not as much data. I don't know if
that was all corrected for. It was corrected for? 100%.
Well,
Yeah, it was corrected for. And the Chinese population was actually the more intact part of the cemetery.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, the bits where we had the more incongruous kind of records were actually from areas that have been impacted in the northern extant end. So that's sort of where we had problems with the physical analysis. But the Chinese materials were actually quite good because they were nearer the house. They hadn't been impacted by any major developments. And the doctor, she's an assistant to the state pathologist in SA that conducted the forensic analysis of that section, was correcting for known variables based on what they knew about various demographics, including the Chinese population at the time. So we're pretty confident that was represented 7 women. So yeah. So again, with the analysis, it's sort of, and it's racial sort of looking at skeletons. Sorry, my brain's not really working there. Is kind of, it's obviously extremely fraught. Obviously in the context of a lot of historical issues with phrenology and all sorts of madness. So looking, defining race is obviously, it's a continuum. You've got some people who are obviously of some genetic stock, and then you've got other people that are not so much, and that's kind of part of the issue that we had. We are confident that the area that was defined in the end as the Chinese cemetery was that because of the grave goods that were around them at the time. And there's probably individuals within that spectrum though, you're dead right, like they're in the Chinese cemetery, but they were probably, maybe they were descendants or married in. We had, while the cemetery officially closed in 1899, there was a period up until 1916 where people were buried with family plots, and then that carried forward a bit unofficially after that. And we had that in the Presbyterian section, definitely, where we had 3 or 4 coffins stacked on each other. In one instance, and there's a lot of that sort of thing. And then obviously with infants and stuff, it is quite tricky to assign that. And we did find quite a lot of children across the cemetery, including in the Chinese section. There was evidence of exhumation. A lot of that was mixed up because of impact, I guess, of the developments across the site. So in some areas it was less obvious than others, but definitely we had a lot of commingling, so like, and again in the Presbyterian section because it was deeper on the site, so you'd have the grave cuts were not as clear. So like given the sand and the soils, basically when the machine stripped back the bitumen, we could see the grave cuts, like they were just the grey marks in the soils. So you're like, oh, happy days. And a lot of the time they were fairly regimented and you could see like just there. And then sometimes they were blurred, which would suggest, that like when we're digging down and there's no clear wall between two graves, either it was a communal plot, which may have been, or someone's dug something up and done it. But that was a clear case of it, yeah. And like the diversity and the of like grave goods and things that we found with people, and like there's a lot of human stories that haven't kind of come out of it yet, which are fascinating as far as that early snapshot. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
We might make room for one more question. Do we have any others before we wrap? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Lauren. Thank you to Scott. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to irrigate a little present to Lauren. Thank you so much from the National Trust, and Scott, thank you to you for joining us tonight. Sarah's been paid. And also just to thank Lotterywest for their support. This is one of our Heritage Conversation series, which we will be having throughout the year, sponsored by Lotterywest. Lotterywest fund the National Trust for these sorts of events to bring our heritage community together so that we can share these stories, which are so important for us to learn and to share and then go and to tell others. And also I'd like to acknowledge Australian Development Corporation, who contributed also to the conservation of the jacket. They are the developers with a small d across the road doing the works that will transform that Perth Girls' School site into the future and bring thousands of more people into this community, which of course will be really good for the cemeteries because this is everybody's park. And we want people to enjoy it and to understand it, as well as to engage with the heritage values of its reason for being. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Alyssa and Cynthia for welcoming and hosting and organising the event. And to our videographer, thank you very much. We'll see you all at the next event. Thank you.